Hi. So during the first lecture, we mentioned culture, that culture was one of the components that sociologists uses to determine how society ticks. This week, we're going to take a look at culture in more detail. So culture in essence consists of knowledge, language, symbols, values, and norms. Knowledge is simply a body of information gathered over time. No specific way by which it's gathered, no specific type of knowledge, just any information. As a matter of fact, if you were to ask the question, can knowledge ever be stagnant? The answer is no, because we're always learning. So, you want to know if I'm 111 years old and I am sick on a hospital bed somewhere and I'm disoriented, do I still have the capacity to gain knowledge? Absolutely. As long as you're alive, you still have the capacity to gain knowledge, because knowledge is gained from a multitude of sources. What we see, what we hear, what we can touch, what we can taste. So using all of our senses and everything around us, we're gaining knowledge. Moving on to language. What is language? Language is simply a mode of communication. With that being said, when you think of things such as English, French, those are actually not quite examples of language, because they represent forms in which language exists. So the types of language include verbal language, written language. So going back to let's say English presents itself in both written form and verbal form. But in addition to that, we have sign language. In addition to that, we have body language. As I'm lecturing right now, you can see my movements in terms of my body language. You see my gesticulations. And this is a type of language. I may have mentioned we have Braille, we have code, Morse code. So those are types of languages. Then we have values and norms. A lot of times we tend to use values and norms interchangeably. However, they're totally different. What makes them different? When you think of values, values is an idea, it's a thought, it's something that you think about, as opposed to norms, which is an action. So norm is something that you do. So I value education, and because I value education, I go to school. So there you have a value, and you back that value up with an action, right? Then we have symbols. Symbols are is simply one item used to represent another. So you have, if I do this, right? Some of you will tell me that I just did a plus. Some of you will tell me that that's a T. Some of you will tell me that that may refer to probably Red Cross had it been red. And all I did was just presented my fingers with two perpendicular lines, as it were. And with symbols, people interpret symbols based on culture, or based on how you were reared. Moving on, when we think of culture, there are quite a few things that come to mind when we think of culture within the field of sociology. So we think of we think of cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is simply where you judge a culture based on the essence of where you stand, the essence of your culture. So things become relative to you based on your own experiences. Then we have ethnocentrism, which takes things a little bit further. So the ethnocentric person believes that his or her culture is superior to other cultures. We have counterculture, and counterculture goes against the grain of the dominant culture, right? So when you think of teenagers, you tell a teenager to not have sex, and what do? They go have sex. You tell a teenager, come in at 10 o'clock. What do? Come in at 11, 12, 1 o'clock. they're so even with teens, this cuts across all racial boundaries. It cuts across cultural boundaries, where kids just tend to be teens just tend to be counterculture. They just tend to go their own way and do whatever they want to do when they want to do it, and that characterizes the teen age. um, then we have subcultures. The subculture is a culture that can be found within the dominant culture, and the dominant culture reflects the majority of culture. Right, here in the United States, one can concede that the dominant culture is Caucasian, and then within the American culture, you have other cultures within the American culture. We have types of societies known as homogeneous and heterogeneous. For heterogeneous societies, this is a society where you have a combination of cultures residing or coexisting, as opposed to a homogeneous population where most people, if not all, share similar cultures, similar values, similar norms. And examples today of a homogeneous society would be North Korea. Um, and interestingly enough, you may think because I just gave you the example of North Korea that it's only quote unquote communist countries that are considered homogeneous. But I move you from the Korea Peninsula and into Japan, and interestingly enough, Japan boasts a 96 to 98% homogeneity rate, which means that most of the people in Japan are, for the most part, Japanese, following the Japanese culture, of Japanese heritage, following the Japanese culture. Now, there are six main types of societies that I want to point out to you at this time. They start off with the hunting and gathering, through the horticultural, through the agrarian, the industrial, the post-industrial, and the transitional society. Um, the hunting and gathering society goes back to the time when people hunted wild animals, ate edible berries as a source of sustenance. Um, so it was, if you were able to catch it, you had food. If you were able to pick it, you had food. By the time we got to the horticultural society, society had grown somewhat. And having said that, society was larger now, so people had learned that they could plant and wait until their crops grew, so they were more stable. During the horticultural society, we saw the development of the hoe, and that also helped with agriculture. Then we have the agrarian society, and the agrarian society was where we saw a dramatic change um, up until this point. Dramatic change in that society was so large now that now we had the introduction of rulers and leaders, and we saw folks planting and have excess, so folks were selling the excess stuff. So we saw selling or bartering or exchange of goods sort of for the first time in our society. Um, then we had the pastoral society. With the pastoral society, we moved away from the vegetable eating, and now we were eating meat. Why? We found out something great. We found out that we didn't have to hunt wild animals anymore. Rather, we could tame them. So imagine, class. Imagine you feel like you want to have chicken for dinner today. You don't have to try to figure out if you're going to catch a chicken or not. Why? Because the chicken is now in your backyard. Right? You have now tamed the chicken. Right? And that is what the pastoral society brought for us. Then we have the industrial society, where we discussed earlier, actually in another lecture, where society moved from manual labor to technical labor. So here we had the introduction of offices, factories, because we had a replacement of again, manual labor. which also meant that now folks had to learn and relearn their trade um, in order to stay within the field. Then we have the post-industrial and the transitional society, and this is basically where we are right now, where we're consumed with knowledge. We're a knowledge-based society. We're consumed with technology, and so our lives now revolve and rotate around technology. So again, just to recap culture, within culture we have the elements of knowledge, language, values, symbols, and norms. Um, we have different sociological terms within the field of culture to include homogeneous and heterogeneous society, subculture, dominant culture, counterculture, cultural relativism, and ethnocentrism, to end on the note that there are different types of societies going back to include hunting and gathering, horticultural, agrarian, pastoral, industrial, post-industrial, and transitional. Have a wonderful evening.